Good afternoon. My name is Bob Giles. I'm the curator of the Nieman Fellowship Program at Harvard. The Nieman Foundation and the Nieman Watchdog Journalism Project are very pleased to welcome you on this special occasion to honor John Walcott as the recipient of the I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence. The generosity, hard work, and innovative thinking of many have enabled us to gather here at the museum today for this inaugural ceremony. So we have a few people to thank. First, to the John S. Knight and James L. Knight Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, and an extraordinarily generous but anonymous supporter. Together, these three institutions have provided the major gift to establish this award and give it a long life. We deeply appreciate the Freedom Forum's invitation to utilize the museum's splendid conference center for our program this afternoon. I also would like to introduce a few individuals who have been central to the creation of the I.F. Stone Medal Project. My colleagues at the Nieman Watchdog Project, Barry Sussman and Dan Frumkin, editors of NiemanWatchdog.org. Marie Martyr, a Nieman Fellow and former diplomatic correspondent for the Washington Post, who made a gift to the Nieman Foundation 12 years ago that has enabled the foundation to advance the cause of watchdog reporting. And Morton Mintz is another member of our Nieman family who has been invaluable in his service as senior advisor to the Watchdog Project. It is nice to see so many Washington area Nieman Fellows here this afternoon and members of the McClatchy Washington Bureau who work for John Walcott. I'd now like to introduce and recognize Jeremy Stone, the elder son of Izzy Stone, whose advice in shaping this project has been so valuable. He serves as chair of the board of advisors to the project and in many ways is devoted to the memory of his father. He has created a website, ifstone.org, that recently posted 700 plus issues of the I.F. Stone Weekly. Jeremy, would you stand and be recognized, please? We will hear about and from John Walcott in a few minutes, but I would like to ask you to salute Warren Strobel and Jonathan Landay, the two reporters who wrote many of the stories under John's direction challenging the Bush administration's case for the war in Iraq. Warren and Jonathan, are you here? Thank you very much. The I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence is given to an American journalist or news executive whose work exemplifies the independent spirit of I.F. Stone, as well as the qualities of integrity, courage, and indefatigability that characterized I.F. Stone's Weekly 1953 to 1971. The Nieman Foundation's decision to align itself with the spirit of independent journalism practiced by I.F. Stone reflects the values expressed in our own mission statement to promote and elevate the standards of journalism. The belief that an independent press remains the country's most important institution, free to probe for facts about wrongdoing or information the government wants to shield from its citizens, is central to the purpose of our fellowship program and our outreach to the larger world of journalism through the Nieman Watchdog Project and other initiatives. Izzy Stone was a model of the resolute, provocative journalist who worked against injustice and inequity and was unafraid to dissent from conventional wisdom. The Nieman Foundation is hopeful that in honoring a journalist for demonstrating the journalistic independence that Izzy Stone evoked can inspire and embolden a current generation of journalists to stick to their principles and speak their minds. The honor we bring to John Walcott this afternoon recognizes his courageous leadership in leading the Knight Ridder Washington Bureau in its coverage of the run-up to the Iraq War in 2002 and early 2003. The stories that moved on the Knight Ridder wire were unappreciated and drew little notice at the time. Most troubling was that the reporting about Iraq by the major news organizations in the country, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, essentially conveyed the administration's case for the war. In doing so, the major papers often influenced the news agenda for other newsletters around the country. Walcott and his reporters produced more than 80 stories about the intelligence claims leading up to the war. In October 2002, for example, Landay and Strobel reported that there was a bitter feud within the government over intelligence claims. Professional military and intelligence officers, the story said, feared that administration hawks were shaping intelligent analysts to support their case for invading Iraq. The story went on to say that much of this controversial data was being supplied by the Iraqi National Congress and its leader, Ahmed Chalabi, who saw himself as a potential successor to Saddam Hussein. It also dealt with Iraq's alleged but later discredited ties to al-Qaeda. This story ran 3 months before President Bush, in his State of the Union address, delivered an ultimatum to Iraq, and nearly 5 months before the U.S. launched its invasion. The story was later described as a genuine tour de force. Walcott's team also was the first to reveal that President Bush had taken the country to war without a plan for post-war Iraq. Clark Hoyt, former Washington bureau chief for Knight Ridder, said in a lecture in 2006 that the reports of bogus and distorted intelligence all seem too tragically obvious today. But believe me, this was lonely journalism in 2002 and 2003. This is an important moment in which we can honor an editor for leading his reporters in their purpose of challenging, virtually alone, administration assertions about the need to go to war in Iraq. The I.F. Stone medal is cast in silver and bears his likeness on the front, and on the reverse, a headline from I.F. Stone's Weekly challenging the veracity of another American president, Lyndon Johnson's claim that the North Vietnamese had attacked U.S. warships in the Tonkin Gulf. It is a great honor for the Nieman Foundation to present the I.F. Stone Award and Medal for Journalistic Independence to John Walcott.
Thank you. I'll give that back to you.
Okay, and we'll give that back to you. Congratulations very much.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thanks to all of you for being here today. I must say that when Bob called me to say that the Nieman Foundation had decided to make me the first recipient of this extraordinary honor, my first reaction was something between shock and surprise. I don't think I've ever been so surprised since my wife, Nancy, who's here, said yes to my marriage proposal, and that was a number of years ago. I can imagine no higher honor for anyone in our profession than to be compared to I.F. Stone. I don't believe that I deserve that honor or that I've earned it, but I must confess that I am grateful that someone, somewhere, for some reason, thinks that I do. When Bob told me that the price of this priceless medal was giving a speech, my second reaction was a troubling recollection of something that David Eisenhower, Richard Nixon's son-in-law, once said: newspaper reporters aren't as interesting as they think they are. I hope that what I have to say isn't confirmation of that. There is confirmation enough on television. My third reaction, when you told me that my selection was based on an anonymous nomination to a somewhat mysterious jury, was to wonder whether Dick Cheney and David Addington had somehow had a hand in it. It is, as Jane Mayer well knows, at least vaguely reminiscent of the selection process for Guantanamo Bay. That, of course, is the skeptical reporter that remains in me even after 19 years as an editor. I'll come back to that subject in a moment because I think it was at the heart of who I.F. Stone was, what his legacy to us is, and what has been missing in American journalism in recent years, not just in the coverage of the Bush administration's case for war in Iraq, but also in our coverage, or the lack thereof, of the Wall Street machinations, congressional abdications, and regulatory alterations that have brought our economy and the well-being of so many Americans to the present precipice. First, though, I want to acknowledge one obvious difference between I.F. Stone and me. Stone wrote that he was, quote, an independent capitalist, the owner of my own enterprise, subject to neither mortgager, factor, nor patron, beholden to no one but my good readers. He wrote that in 1963, and he added that at that time, quote, young men setting out in a career of journalism must find their niche in some huge newspaper or magazine combine. As you can see, I am no longer young, but that pretty much describes my career. For more than a decade, I've worked for two publicly owned newspaper companies, Knight Ridder and McClatchy, and before that I worked for Newsweek, for the Wall Street Journal, and for U.S. News and World Report. Those associations, however, have been a blessing, not a curse, and I would like to take a moment, with your indulgence, to thank a few of the people who were foolish enough to hire me at those places and patient enough to teach me how to do my job. We'd be here all day and all night if I thanked all of them, but they include the late Bob King at the Bergen Record, Mel Elfin, Henry Hubbard, and Jim Doyle at Newsweek, Al Hunt, Ken Bacon, and Walt Mossberg at the Wall Street Journal, Mimi McLaughlin and Mike Ruby at U.S. News, Clark Hoyt, Kathleen Carroll, and the late Gary Blonston at Knight Ridder, and David Westfall and Howard Weaver at McClatchy. Stone also wrote that before he became an independent capitalist, he was fortunate in my employers, and I feel the same way. I want to single out two remarkable CEOs for whom I've been privileged to work. Tony Ritter and Gary Pruitt have come in for a lot of criticism in recent years, but let me say this as plainly as I can. First Tony and now Gary have never been anything but supportive of the journalism that we've tried to do in the Knight Ridder and the McClatchy Washington bureaus. Not once, not one time, has either of them second-guessed our editorial decisions or our stories, even when bigger and better-known news organizations were reporting the opposite. Not once has either of them bent to any political or economic pressures or let any of the heat that they've taken trickle down to us. If you've seen Bill Moyer's documentary, Buying the War, about the run-up to the Iraq War, then you know that that wasn't the case everywhere. I also want to take a moment to tell you why this award is a little bit embarrassing to me. That's because it rightly belongs to so many other people who worked long and hard to scrutinize the Bush administration's pronouncements about Iraq and al-Qaeda, about Iraq's nuclear program, and about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. Day in and day out, Jonathan Landay, Warren Strobel, Joe Galloway, and their editor, Renee Schoaf, pried open doors, pried loose documents, and pried out the truth. We withheld Joe's byline from much of what we wrote to protect his sources, and this is the first time that any of us has talked publicly about the crucial role that Joe played in this reporting. Sadly, he can't be with us today. Happily, that's because he's in Canberra at an Australian Army conference. This award, though, belongs to John, Joe, Renee, and Warren, and many other people at least as much as it belongs to me, and maybe more. And to me, it also confirms the virtues of old-fashioned beat reporting, of getting to know the people and the issues over a long period of time, rather than hopping up some career ladder from job to job as quickly as you can. In 2001, Joe, John, Warren, and I had a combined 84 years of experience covering foreign affairs, and it would be an understatement to say that that was helpful. It also belongs in part, this award does, to a number of officials in the Bush administration, some of whose names many of you know well, some of whose names you may never know. They worked in the CIA, in the DIA, in other intelligence agencies, in the uniformed military, in the State Department, in the Defense Department, in the Energy Department, in the Department of Justice, and elsewhere. It may be true, as a wonderful book about I.F. Stone is titled, that all governments lie, but it is not true that everyone in government lies. In fact, one of the striking things about what in that October 2002 story we called the Bush administration's double-time march to war in Iraq was that President Bush, Vice President Cheney, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, and the others who were calling the tune ignored the advice, the dissents, and the warnings of so many experts in their own government. Why, in a nutshell, was our reporting different from so much other reporting? One important reason is that we sought out the dissidents and we listened to them instead of serving as stenographers to high-ranking officials and Iraqi exiles. I'm afraid that much the same thing may have happened on Wall Street. Power and money and celebrity, in other words, can blind you. And one of the things that's gone wrong with Washington journalism is this notion that the value of every source is directly proportional to his or her rank. In truth, in my experience, the relationship is more often an inverse one. That brings up a larger point, and one that I think is part of what went wrong back in 2002 and what may have gone wrong on Wall Street. Instead of being members of the Fourth Estate, too many Washington reporters have been itching to move up an estate or two. I.F. Stone, on the other hand, knew well that reporters, by definition, are outsiders. After he died, Pat Oliphant drew a marvelous cartoon of him, Stone, standing at the gates of heaven, holding a pencil and a notebook. Like all the great political cartoons, it says more than words ever could. St. Peter in this cartoon is on the phone to a higher authority, and he's saying, "Yes, that I.F. Stone, sir. He says he doesn't want to come in. He'd rather hang around out here and keep things honest." Now, being an outsider, a gadfly, a muckraker, isn't always as much fun as being an insider, a celebrity journalist out on TV in the lecture circuit. Worse, in these troubled times for the news media, it makes enemies, sometimes powerful ones, and it can offend readers, advertisers, and I'm sorry to tell you, as conditions in the business continue to worsen, potential employers in public relations and other industries outside the news business. There is a great temptation to play it safe, greater than I have ever seen, and understandable. But there were much bigger problems with the media, I think, after 9/11 than just too cozy relationships with the wrong sources and timidity about challenging a popular president in the wake of an attack on all of us. There was simple laziness. A great deal of what the Bush administration said, especially about Iraq and al-Qaeda, made no sense. Yet very few reporters bothered to check it out. What I'm talking about is the idea that a largely secular Sunni regime, run by a guy whose two sons spent most of their evenings out swilling Hennessy, was allied with a Wahhabi fundamentalist like bin Laden, is ridiculous. And at the minimum, it bore close examination. Now, Ahmed Chalabi, who Bob mentioned earlier, is an intelligent man, majored in mathematics, something I could never do. But a lot of the stories that he was spinning that got picked up and repeated wholesale made even less sense. One of my favorites was the story of a Kurd who claimed he had the run of all of Saddam's secret bioweapons facilities, maybe as a test subject. Another one of his sources failed a polygraph test, something nobody bothered to ferret out. Too many reporters just ran with what they were handed. They handed bullhorns to people who already had megaphones. Now, some of my colleagues have cited the fact that the Democrats in Congress failed to challenge the administration on Iraq as a reason for their lapses. But the Democrats' dereliction of duty doesn't explain the media's, much less excuse it. Finally, as Bob mentioned, the most highly regarded news organizations in the country, led by the New York Times and especially the editorial page of the Washington Post, were wrong about Iraq. And many, many other newspapers, some of which I'm intimately familiar with, simply followed them like lemmings over the cliff. Nevertheless, 7 years later, concentration in the news business is getting worse, not better, especially when it comes to foreign and national news. Only a handful of newspapers, the Times, the Post, the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, Christian Science Monitor, the AP, and McClatchy, still have significant foreign operations. The Boston Globe, the Baltimore Sun, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Newsday have abandoned their foreign bureaus and are cutting back in Washington. So are the major television networks. Newhouse and Copley are eliminating their Washington bureaus. Hearst and others are downsizing here. We've reached a point, I'm afraid, where the journalism of I.F. Stone is now very much at risk from a combination of economic, technological, political, and even philosophical developments. I've talked a little bit about the pressures on news companies to cut costs to compensate for falling revenues, and I know there are those out there who think that's fine, that the traditional mainstream media have so discredited themselves on Iraq and other issues that we should all say good riddance to them and turn to the blogosphere for our news and analysis. There are two reasons why I think that's foolish, at least for now. The first is that the blogosphere, much like cable television and talk radio, reflects the political polarization in our country today. People go to Fox News or MSNBC, to O'Reilly or Air America, to Daily Kos or redstate.org, to have their biases reaffirmed, not to have their assumptions challenged or the truth exposed. It's been a good business model, but I don't think it's good journalism. And I suspect that I.F. Stone, as hard to pin down as he was ideologically, might agree. That same kind of polarization, coupled with the economic weakness of the news media, has both encouraged and enabled the government, and here I mean the Bush administration specifically, to continuously restrict the amount of information that's available to us, the kind of information that was such valuable grist for I.F. Stone. Some of it's been done using the time-honored national security excuse, but nowadays freedom of information requests, for example, frequently are answered with, well, I'll get back to you, it'll take us a year to find that, or, increasingly, if you want that, sue us, knowing that the news media doesn't have very deep pockets anymore. And the government has plenty of lawyers. The second reason that I don't think even the best blog sites are a substitute for the mainstream media is that for now, bloggers simply cannot do all of the things that mainstream media organizations still do. In June, to give you one example, we completed an investigation of the Bush administration's detainee program, which you might have read about in a piece by Tony Lewis in the New York Review of Books. I think I.F. Stone probably would have liked it, but it took the lead reporter, Tom Lasseter, other reporters, and Travis Haying, a photographer from the paper we own in Wichita, Kansas, to 11 countries on 3 continents over 8 months. And that's simply a kind of reporting that is still out of reach for your average blogger. Technology and economics, I think, have taken another toll on the kind of reporting that Stone did and the kind that we need so desperately today. Virtually every reporter today, with a few precious exceptions, has become a wire service reporter, a slave to the old UPI motto of a deadline every minute. In the scramble to try to make more money online, they also become cameramen, soundmen, and producers. And all of that producing simply leaves less time for digging, and worse, less time for thinking. That brings me to my last point. Relying on the Times or McClatchy or any other news source for the truth is dumb, but it is infinitely preferable to the pernicious philosophical notions that there's no such thing as truth, that truth is relative, or that, as some journalists seem to believe, the truth can be found midway between the two opposing poles of any argument. My father, who is with us today, made his living designing navigation instruments for aircraft and missiles and submarines. And although my mathematical and engineering skills are, shall we say, less evident than his, I learned 2 important lessons from the work that he did. The first is that if you want to know where you are, it's helpful to know where you started. The second is a concept that's called ground truth, which in a nutshell means checking your calculations against information collected on the ground. In other words, reporting. Now, I know that I'm wading into some deep and pretty muddy water here, but I'm doing so in deference, or really more precisely in reverence, to the fact that I.F. Stone was a scholar as well as a journalist. He taught himself ancient Greek to write about the trial of Socrates, and I still struggle with modern French, but I will wade in nevertheless. Does the truth lie halfway between, say, slavery and abolition, or between segregation and civil rights, or between communism and democracy? If you quote Dietrich Bonhoeffer or Winston Churchill, in other words, must you then give equal time and credence to Hitler and Joseph Goebbels? If you write an article that's critical of John McCain, are you then obligated to devote an identical number of words to some criticism of Barack Obama, and vice versa? The idea that truth is merely a social construct, that it's subjective, in other words, first appeared in academia as a corruption of postmodern European philosophy, but it's really taken root in our culture without our really realizing it or understanding its implications. It began in the academic world with arguments, for example, that some southwestern Indians' belief that humans are descended from a subterranean world of supernatural spirits is, as one archaeologist said, just as valid as archaeology. As NYU philosophy professor Paul Boghossian puts it in a wonderful little book called Fear of Knowledge, the idea that there are many equally valid ways of knowing the world, with science being just one of them, has taken very deep root. Although this kind of thinking, relativism and constructivism, started on the left, many conservatives now feel empowered by it too, and some of them have embraced it with a vengeance on issues ranging from global warming and evolution to the war in Iraq. It's my favorite quote of the last 7 years. Journalists live in the reality-based world, a White House official said to Ron Suskind, who was writing for the New York Times Magazine back in 2004. The world doesn't really work that way anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. I respectfully disagree. The church was wrong. Copernicus and Galileo were right. There is not one truth for Fox News and another for the nation. Fair is not always balanced, and balanced is not always fair. No matter how devoutly they may have believed their own propaganda, Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling were wrong about Enron, and a whole bunch of very smart, very rich people were very wrong about mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps. President Bush was wrong to think that it would be a simple matter to make Iraq the mother of all Mideast democracy. Or, as the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau said when he was asked what he thought historians might say about the First World War, he answered, "They will not say that Belgium invaded Germany." I'm not talking here about matters of taste or partisan politics or, heaven help us, of faith, whether Monet or Manet was a better painter or whether Jesus was the Messiah, a prophet, or a fraud. Those are personal matters, beliefs, opinions, preferences, of which we all must learn to be more, not less tolerant. As Harry G. Frankfurt, who's an emeritus professor of philosophy at Princeton, puts it in a wonderful little book called On Truth, which is the sequel to his first little volume, which is called On Bullshit. It seems ever more clear to me that higher levels of civilization must depend even more heavily on a conscientious respect for the importance of honesty and clarity in reporting the facts, and on a stubborn concern for accuracy in determining what the facts are. That is what I.F. Stone always sought to do, and I think it's what journalists should always strive to do. If, in the short run, it seems costly, I think we've all seen in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and now on Wall Street and on Main Street, that the costs of not doing so are far, far greater. Thank you all.